Good evening, everybody. Thanks for joining me. If you're part of the replay team, thanks for coming back and taking a watch of what we have for you tonight. We have a very special guest, Dr. Krystal Hans, board certified forensic entomologist, which has to deal with insects. We'll get into that later on, just in case you didn't know. She's also an assistant professor at Purdue University. She has trained law enforcement and pathologists and coroners in Indiana and Ohio. She is also the co-founder of the Case Symposium, which just finished up its second annual event, which we're going to talk about tonight, amongst other things. And she is a cold case victims family advocate. So, Dr. Krystal, thanks for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me.
So before we get started into doing this, I just want to make sure that everyone knows I am wearing my purple shirt today in honor of Domestic Violence Month and for all the victims that are out there. I'm putting up the DV hotline. If you are a victim of domestic violence or you know somebody who is a domestic violence victim, please share this number with them. Get them the help that they need. Don't think that people are going to be able to get out of the situation they're in. Sometimes they're going to need help from friends and family. So please don't forget that. Okay, with that little message, I want to introduce again Dr. Krystal Hans. Thanks for coming on, Krystal. Good to see you again.
You as well.
So we just finished up the second annual Cold Case Symposium, which I was a part of, which was actually kind of exciting. So just let's go through some of the event here. So tell me, what was your first take on it? How did you, for the second time around, they're getting easier or just or what happens?
Well, this was a really tremendous event. I think Ryan Backman and I are just thrilled with how it turned out, with the amount of support that we received and some of the responses that we've gotten from attendees. It was incredible. It was a really emotional and impactful event. I don't know if it gets any easier trying to organize these large events with so many speakers and so many different components, but just the amount of feedback that I've received so far from people that attended and from the organizations that were a part of it has been just so powerful. So
yes, we're going to get into some of those organizations because I was introduced to a couple new groups of people that I didn't know existed, and I think the general public needs to know more about them, because one of the things about being an advocate, if you're a cold case advocate for either the victims or the families, it's important that once again there are organizations out there. So my audience has been introduced to Ryan Backman and Cold Case Project. So Project Cold Case, excuse me. So everyone seems to know him and everybody loves him. And when you meet him in person, you can understand why. He's this big burly guy. He is a life-size giant, so to speak. But he's a gentle giant, and he's a gentleman, and for what he's gone through and how he can turn that around and do what he's done is pretty amazing.
Yeah, he's been a fantastic partner and co-host for this. And Ryan and I met last year when I hosted the first Cold Case Symposium, which was in Arizona last year. And that was the first time that I got to hear him speak and learn about his organization and all of the work that he does with the over 1,400 families that he works with. And so he was a real instrumental part in trying to pull together this team of speakers and organizations and supporters that we had to be able to make this year's event successful. So I'm really fantastic that you've had him on here, that your audience has heard from him, and they know a bit about Project Cold Case and the amazing work that they're doing.
Yeah, it's actually amazing. And when, the symposium that you had, I know for a lot of people it might not be available to be able to go there in person, right? So I know you've had it. The first one was in Arizona State University, and now you had it in Purdue University in Indiana. And we'll talk maybe about the future if we have time. But there's another angle, right? People can watch online and stream it live.
Yeah, so we wanted to make sure that there wasn't a barrier for people to attend. And I understand that West Lafayette, Indiana is not necessarily an easy place for everybody to get to. So we made this event hybrid, and we did that in the first year of the symposium as well. So we had an in-person attendance option and an online option to make sure that we can reach as many people as possible and really spread the word about what the needs are of these families that are going through this horrible ordeal with a lost loved one.
Right, and there was so many different topics that we spoke about. So we won't be able to chance to get through all of them, but there was one that really stuck with me, and that's the ethics in the true crime community and the advocacy part of it. And one of the quotes that stuck with me, and I kind of been repeating it to myself over and over again, is exploitation is not advocacy. And it's something that kind of hits you. You don't really think about it because you see what's going on in some of the true crime world, and you understand what exactly it's meant by exploitation is not advocacy. So let's talk a little bit about the ethics. I know we went through it in the symposium, but for the audience, what kind of ethics are we really trying to narrow down here?
Yeah, so I'm glad that you brought that up, and I think that's a great tagline, and that was something that I think was emphasized throughout the day with all of our symposium speakers. And we actually hosted a panel the night before the symposium with another organization that supports families, Season of Justice. And the topic of that panel was navigating ethics in true crime. And it was a discussion to bring together different people from different backgrounds to offer their opinions about what are some of the dangers that we see with this incredible growth in the true crime genre, where there's often exploitation for purposes of entertainment because people are fascinated by the true crime element, and they don't necessarily understand that there's people behind those stories. And so one of the lines that Ryan and I had used in our communications about the symposium was, what we're trying to do with this event is offer real stories, real support, and real resources. And I know that Ryan mentioned in his talk several times the difference between true crime and real crime. And those real crime elements, that's unfortunately what the families are dealing with. And they're continuously exploited by different true crime podcasts or writers or people on social media, people that are just fascinated by the story and don't understand the human element, and they don't think about humanizing the victim and the families that were impacted.
Right, yeah, that's something that Ryan had said too about the difference between true crime and real crime, and that kind of stuck with me too. Now that you mentioned that too, and yeah, we see a lot of good, a lot of people trying to get exposure for the cases, and we understand that, and then we see people doing it for likes and clicks,
Right.
and when you're doing this and you're not discussing it with the family first, and all of a sudden this video shows up, whatever. You're probably doing more harm than you are good in certain aspects, and you need to look within at that point.
Right. And that's something I don't think people are always malicious in their intent. I don't think that they understand the full scope of the consequences of those actions. And just to speak a little bit about my role as an educator. So I'm an assistant professor at Purdue, and I teach forensic science and forensic entomology courses. And Joe, I had mentioned this to you, that one of the things that I do with my students when they come into their first forensic science course, just to get at some of those human elements that are often neglected. I have a lot of students that watch CSI, they watch Criminal Minds, they watch all of these crime dramas. And so they have what they think is, they know what forensic science is like. And so I'll ask them, okay, raise your hand, who can name a serial killer? Almost every single student's hand goes up. And then I follow that with, okay, now raise your hand if you can name any one of those victims impacted by that serial killer. Very few, often no hands go up when I ask that question. And then that brings us into this conversation about, okay, so what are you focusing on here? What is being popularized in the media? It's these horrific crimes, and it's the glorification of some of these serial killers. That's who's getting all of that attention. We're not giving attention to the families and to those victims that really need our help.
And it's a real tough balance when you're trying to do what you're doing and putting together this group of advocates to try to do this and combat it almost. And that's really, what it comes down to. So Raul over here, Catch List, is so glad so many people are talking about ethics and advocacy, and it's important. And it certainly is. You can't stress this enough. I talked about this with Ryan, and I wanted to talk about it with you too, because from when I used to do this for a living, when you're talking to the families and you're trying, I tell you, the emotions that people go through when you're talking to them, it's unbelievable. Some, they go through every range of emotion within a matter of minutes, everything from fear and anger and upset, and just go right through it all. And I can't imagine if you're sitting there at home and all of a sudden you see this TV show pop up on your, on your family, and you're like, how come nobody told me?
Right. Right. And unfortunately, that happens far too often. And we've seen this big boom in this true crime industry that's just looking for new content that they can use. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. You want to share the stories, but you have to do it in a way that is supporting the family and supporting the victims.
Exactly, right. I mean, when it comes down to it, people can do what they like. This whole true crime genre. I mean, I really don't have any problem with it, but just keep the families and the victims in mind, right? I mean, we've seen some terrible things, like people get crime scene photos and then charge people for them, and all kinds of crazy stuff like that. And you can't do that. You just can't, because there's a moral and ethical issue that you really need to have. And unfortunately, not everybody has that moral compass.
Yeah. And like I said, I don't think that everybody's necessarily doing it with malicious intentions. Sometimes I think they don't understand that other perspective. And so that's one of the really important things that we try to, and I hope that message was clear last week in our symposium, that we tried to express and reinforce with all of our speakers throughout the day, is the humanizing of those families, that these are real people that are really being impacted. And so that's one of our central messages that we really want to get out there. And there are certainly people that are in true crime that don't understand that perspective. They're not a survivor or a family member, and they don't see how that directly impacts people. And so sharing that information and getting that message out, I think, is a good step in that direction.
Right. So so we did our our kind of thing out there about ethics and true crime. We get that out there. People either like it or they don't, but it's just about, hey, just remember that there's real victims and families out there. So let's pivot to some of the other guests in there. So this symposium, I was there from the very beginning, and I stayed, of course, to the very end. I saw every speaker, and some of them I didn't even know about, in regards to the advocacy that they're doing. One in particular, Light the Way, with the missing persons. I thought this was great because, and I'm to blame for this too. We tend to focus on the homicides in that respect, and not so much on the missing persons. But when you helped me with the book, when I wrote the Cold Case Handbook, we talked about the trilogy, right? Homicides, cold sexual assault, and missing persons. So sometimes I need to center myself and get back onto that thing, that there are really three different types of cold cases and victims and families out there. And so Light the Way was this kind of interesting aspect in missing persons, because we don't really see that much in that avenue. So I was actually kind of impressed.
Yeah, so that was one of our approaches, is that we wanted to make sure that community had a voice in this Cold Case Symposium. And so Light the Way was a tremendous presentation that Shana Richard gave about their organization and about the advocacy work that they do. They shared details about the lost loved ones that these families are missing and have been searching for. And it's more than just, here's a picture of them, here's their poster. It was about who they are as a person, and who are these people that are missing them, and what is this void that is left when these people go missing. And so I really thought Light the Way did a fantastic job showcasing their advocacy, but also highlighting the real people that are behind these cases. It's more than just the names, it's more than just the posters. And so they were an incredible element to our symposium.
And as a bonus, they brought family members with them.
Yes.
So, and what I mean by a bonus, you from just being in the crowd and watching this, the bonus is, here is a real family member, and you can listen to the pain in their voice and see their facial expressions. And that's what I think a lot of people really need to see.
Absolutely. And one of those family members that was in attendance in person at this event, she was incredible. And she is a fierce advocate for her mom. And she was able to speak to everybody at the symposium. She was able to participate in the panel, in the Q&A. And she sent me I hope she doesn't mind me sharing, but Allison, if you're out there and listening, she sent me one of the most powerful and beautiful reflections of her time at the symposium. And it was the day after. She said she thought about it her whole drive home. Mind you, she drove 5 hours to be able to attend this symposium in person. and then immediately drove back to Pennsylvania. And in her drive, she thought about her experience and what she felt when she was hearing all of these organizations and hearing from survivors and being able to ask those questions and have those conversations. And it was such a powerful piece that she wrote. And I asked her if I could share it with some of my administration here at Purdue, just to reinforce this is the benefit of the symposium by bringing all of these people together. So that was a really interesting and fantastic part to have her in attendance.
Yes, and actually I got a chance to speak with her too when she asked some of the questions. And it's tough when you try to answer questions for other police departments and you don't know exactly what they did or what they're doing. It's tough, and like I said, I've heard that complaint. I'll call it a complaint because it's more than that, but it's pain and suffering and everything else that goes along with it. But just you have to have the empathy when you're dealing with people because you have no idea what some places put people through.
Absolutely. I appreciate that you were in attendance to be able to offer that connection as former law enforcement. Sometimes people might have a certain stigma associated with law enforcement or they've had negative interactions. And so I thought it was really great that you were able to give suggestions and firsthand experience just to show that there are law enforcement that do care. They're out there.
And actually, I think I shocked Ryan too, because even Ryan said he's a little more progressive than I am with certain things, Well, and I'm not way with a lot of things when it came to deals because I did this for a couple of years. And when you're dealing with the amount of caseload that we had and the family members and you're talking to people, and it's just like you understand their frustration and you can't keep on saying to them that I don't have enough people, right? I mean, that's basically what it comes down to. There's not enough time, there's not enough people, and there's not enough money. And it's basically always what seems to be the trifecta that goes on there. And, so we happen to be more open about these things. So we used to give out the cases, through the FOIL request. And I know, Ryan brings up a great point where you say, well, people could screw up the case and this and that. And I say, after 30 or 40 years, maybe it's time to give a group of people, right? Maybe not so much the entire universe, but like, for instance, you have students that are doing this now.
Right.
And there's a couple other colleges that are doing this. So you're working now within a small group of individuals, working with police and doing these things. I don't see any harm in that.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the reasons why we initially wanted to start this cold case symposium. So one of my colleagues at Arizona State University, Lauren Widener, she teaches similar classes. We had students that were in a similar mindset, and we really saw this opportunity that our students are an entire community of people that have a vested interest in this, and that we have an opportunity where we can train them on having that empathy, being victim focused, incorporating those human elements when they're thinking about these cold cases, and we can shape them when they go out into their careers, whether it's forensic science or law enforcement, criminal justice of some capacity, or they go into advocacy. And so we have a real opportunity to work with an entirely different community of people that are interested and available. And that really gets at some of those limitations with resources that we see with law enforcement. And I understand that there's not time and people and money, and those things are always going to be limited. But if you turn down all of these students, that's another resource that you're not utilizing. So I think we have a real opportunity here.
Yeah, you certainly do. And this is the kind of message that I've been sending out to police executives out there. You need to reach out to these colleges that are doing these programs, like these symposiums, like the institutes. And then you can't be turning around and telling me you're having a problem with recruitment. Well, after a while, like I said, if I had hair, I'd pull it out of my head, because here's the golden opportunity, right? So here yourself, it's not like this is hidden anywhere. This is a public event and forum. It's not only in person, but it's online. And, you can't tell me that local police departments didn't even know about this or hear about this and say, hey, this is a good opportunity. We have a couple of these old cases. Let's get embedded with these kids and let's start, because if they're already interested in this field, I mean, gosh.
Yeah. Capitalize on that opportunity and see it as a way for us to work together, not work against each other.
Yeah, so here's one of your students. I found the symposium was amazing. I'm extremely happy for the opportunity to hear these students. as a story, excuse me, these stories as a student at Purdue. So there you go. And here she is. Lauren is out there.
Oh,
Lauren was invited to the show. Unfortunately, she was dealing with some internet issues where she lived, but Lauren will be in a future show, so don't worry about that. We will definitely have her on there. So it is something that, yeah, no problem, Lauren. Thanks for watching. So we talked about, Light the Way. We talked about, and then there was another guest that did the missing persons from Australia,
absolutely.
Lauren. Yeah, Lauren. I went on before her, and then she's like, great, I have to go on now after that, right? Because I was a little, I guess Ryan said I had too much caffeine. So Lauren, but here's she had some great ideas. So the thing I really liked about Lauren's presentation, she had these cups, and coffee cups that they would sell the coffee in the stores, and they had the missing persons information on it. So it's like a walking wanted poster.
Yeah. So I have some of those cups from the event that she was nice enough to leave for me. And these are such an incredible example of being able to advocate for the families in a very creative and unique way. So these are biodegradable cups that have a graphical design, a representation of the person, and then shares a story about the person's life. So not focusing on all the events that led up to them being a missing person, but focusing on who they are and really bringing in that human element. And she is incredibly creative. We were so fortunate to have her, and not just have her in person at the symposium, but she flew over here from Australia. She got here early. She really embedded herself in life at Purdue. And she was such a powerful speaker and just delivered a really fantastic message and showcased some of the really interesting and creative mechanisms that she's been able to use to support the families and offer a resource in terms of how can they start to heal? How can they start to get some benefit out of talking about it and sharing these stories? So she's such an incredible and powerful advocate. We were so fortunate to have her.
Yeah, and I didn't get a chance to speak to her a lot, but just from the little interaction I did have with her, she seems to be a special person in regards to that. I mean, the way she talks, she's got that calm voice, and you want to listen to her story about her brother, and it's actually kind of amazing. So, like I said, these coffee cups. I mean, think about a great idea when people say, what can I do? Well, here's an idea, right? So they sell the coffee, and they're in the cups. The person sitting on the train, they read about it, and is it so much that somebody's going to solve a case because of this coffee cup? Probably not. But the issue comes down to it keeps that person in the limelight. I think it makes the family feel better about that their family member hasn't been forgotten, and you never know, right? So you won't know if you don't do it, right? You're definitely not going to find anybody if you don't do these things.
Yeah.
So that's pretty. So Lauren's story and what she does is actually pretty amazing too. So like I said, I'm going to reach out to her, and hopefully we can get her on this show also, because I think a lot of people need to hear about the missing persons angle and the advocacy part.
Absolutely.
And we got into in the symposium too. We got into a little bit with the investigative genealogy, which was actually pretty interesting.
Yeah. So we had Jason Moran, law enforcement and president of JEMM Consulting. And so he was able to speak a bit about genetic genealogy and some of the advances and resources and opportunities for some of these longstanding cold cases that might have DNA samples, and how we can use this new tool of genealogy to try to make some of those connections. And so, I thought that was a really great element of the symposium.
Yeah, like I said, I've been learning about the IgG, and getting in, getting just, not that I'm going to be able to do any of that stuff, but it kind of intrigues me about how it's, how that is built. And, the presentation was actually kind of interesting in the respect that, kind of laid it out pretty easy for everybody.
Yeah. And so the great thing about Jason's presentation is that he talked about the impacts of this. And then we also had sponsorship from Verigen Qiagen, where they donated several DNA kits for attendees, so that if they were interested, and sometimes this is a barrier where people, there's a cost that's associated with these kits, and it's a pretty significant cost sometimes. And so they were able to donate those kits for our event so that people that were interested and hadn't received their DNA profile before had an opportunity, and they could do that at our event.
Yeah, that was actually pretty interesting, and Ryan's like, "Hey, do you want a kit?" I'm like, "Yeah, no, thanks." But it was actually kind of interesting because I didn't even know they were going to do that, and I think the kids loved that. I mean, the students that were there, they ate that up. I mean, and I think these kits, like, I think they cost like about $100 too, right? So,
Yeah,
at least maybe more, or just about that. But so everybody at the symposium had a chance to submit their DNA for the profiling, and it's great.
yeah.
And that was actually an added bonus.
Yeah,
for a lot of people.
Fantastic sponsors, that's for sure.
So how can people, if they missed the symposium that was online, how would they be able to get a chance to see that?
Yeah, so our production team, which thank you to our Purdue production team that was there the entire day. They did a fantastic job. And they are currently editing and putting together all of the videos. So they are going to have every single speaker's video as a separate file. And we're going to be posting that to our Cold Case Symposium website and making that available and sharing it with all of our speakers so that they can use that material on their platforms as well. So there'll be a lot of opportunities. Yeah.
And I have that link already in the section on the description of this. And I also have, if you want to learn more about Dr. Hans, everything you want to know about her links are on there. The Cold Case Symposium is on there too. So is that going to be the same link, the Purdue link that they'll go to, or do I need to post something else down the road?
So it'll be that link, and then we'll probably have a separate website as well that will share all of those resources.
Okay, so that'd be great. So that's when that comes out, just let me know and I can update the site if I have the wrong one, so that if people want to catch up and want to watch the speakers and what we were talking about and get more involved in this in the future, since we mentioned the word future, let's talk about that. So what kind of thing do we have on the plate for the future for the Cold Case Symposium?
Well, the work never ends, especially in the advocacy arena. So we have already started planning for next year's event, and so one of the connections that we tried to make this year is that Project Cold Case and me at Purdue were really working together really closely, working with my students on several cases. Project Cold Case is based in Florida, in Jacksonville, Florida. And so as you can imagine, there's a lot of families in that area that Ryan works with through Project Cold Case. So our plan for next year, and our plan for every subsequent year of the symposium, is we want to move around to different locations. So next year we're going to be in Jacksonville, Florida.
Nice.
Next fall. We haven't finalized a date yet, but as soon as we have it, we'll send it your way. And so our goal is to have these symposia and bring together a group of impactful speakers that are doing great work and be able to raise awareness and support the families that are in those areas. And so by moving around to different locations, we can offer this to families that are in need in different cities. And so we plan to move around to different states and then eventually take it international and offer a symposium, maybe in Australia with Lauren O'Keefe. So
nice.
That's our plan for the future, is to move around and to be able to really support these families in different areas.
All right. Well, when you look at the sheer numbers of cold cases just alone in this country, there's plenty of opportunities in states and cities that definitely need this kind of advocacy, especially for what Ryan does. I wish we can multiply that by hundreds and get one in every city, because the work he does is actually kind of amazing, work with the families and getting these things done. And the thing about him is that he's got those connections with the police departments, and you can't put a price tag on that.
Yeah, and being able to facilitate those conversations and help families get the access they need and help law enforcement communicate to the families, which is sometimes a challenge, is a really important element.
Yeah, certainly. And like I try to tell people, it's family members specifically, that it's not always the detective to blame for certain things, because he or she has a boss, he or she has, they have a boss, and there are different levels of what they want you to do, how fast you want to do it, how many cases to work on, and what to do next, kind of thing. Yeah. And we've seen police departments shrink greatly, and I really worry about what's going to happen in the future for this.
Right. And I will just add to that, Joe. if there's any educators that are listening at any point. So one of our other focuses is that we really want to make sure that students are involved in this mission. And so if you're an educator and you think that there's a way that we can partner, please reach out. So please send us an email. And if there's an opportunity for us to host a symposium in your area and partner with your institution, we would love to explore that.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and actually, and people are liking this. So here we got my buddy Jay here. Great idea, moving around to different areas. Yeah, because some family members think they've forgotten, and they they worry about this. And I don't know if you know who Dana Pohl. She just jumped in. She works at uncovered.com.
Hi, Dana.
So, yep. So she jumped in there. We had Dana and we had Andrea Cipriano from Uncovered not too long ago too. So I've been really pushing this advocacy bit. Because it's really important. I mean, and we can sit and talk about homicide cases all day long. I had thousands of them, and if you want me to regurgitate all that stuff, I can. But at this point, I think it's more of a an idea to try to get the resources out there, the people like yourselves that really care about the families and the victims, in order to try to get them the help that they need to get through this.
Yeah, you can never have too much support, and there's always a need for more hands to help.
So before we switch off to the next topic of forensic entomology, is there anything else about the symposium that I forgot to mention, or you want to get in there?
I think you did a great job. Just a couple of the other speakers that I wanted to highlight.
Sure.
They really brought a different perspective. So another law enforcement element that we have was Brandon Johnson from the Grundy County Coroner's Office, who shared a very different approach that showed the dedication of law enforcement. So he has a case that he has been working on diligently for years, trying to identify a set of remains that was located in his county. And so he shared that story of perseverance, and how does he follow up on all of these leads, and what is he actively doing to try to support the family that doesn't necessarily know that their loved one is out there, that's unidentified. So I thought he was a fantastic speaker as well.
Yep, I forgot about that one too, but that was actually a very powerful thing too, and especially when the reporter asked him, it's like, "Why are you doing this?"
Yeah.
Yeah. So here's the reporters asking him, like, "Well, why are you doing this?"
Yeah.
I thought that was pretty self-explanatory, but hey, so. Yeah, that was actually a really good presentation too. It also shows you that how one individual can make a difference.
Absolutely.
So we need those coroners and medical examiners and cold case detectives out there, and specifically the supervisors, right? So I mean, I was a supervisor, so I understand this thing, and I blame the supervisors for a lot of the stuff because I was one. So I understand that you, as a supervisor, dictates a lot of what gets done or doesn't get done.
Right.
And it's important that we, that you step up into that role. And cold case is just not for everybody. This isn't a place to go. It's not a retirement home. You don't go there to retire. It's more work than you can ever imagine in regards to that. And, some days I'd say, like, what am I doing to myself? I could just go back to a detective squad where it's a lot easier.
Right.
Just kind of managing the day-to-day cases and then, move on to the next one. Instead of coming into work and having the same cases sitting on your desk that have been there for 20 years, and you have to figure out what to do.
Yeah. I also just wanted to mention, so one of my former students, Braden Johnson, spoke at the event, and even though he said he was nervous beforehand, as soon as he got on stage, you couldn't see any of that. And he talked about his experience as a student in my class, coming to me with a case that was a direct family connection. It's his wife's family member, and wanting to work on that as his cold case project a couple of years ago in my class. And so he shared that story, and the victim's family was in attendance as well, which just made for a very moving, very powerful presentation. I was really proud of him as a student. He's a great representation of the power that students have in this community.
Yeah, I know, absolutely. And he married into it. So it was kind of interesting, and in that respect too, where he really didn't sign up for this, so to speak. He kind of just wound up in it, and then he took the role in there. I mean, the case is very interesting, and maybe we can get him on and we can talk about that case too, because I think he did for a very young man, being able to put together the case and the investigation and talking to people and finding witnesses. I mean, I'm sitting there going like, how old is this kid?
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Was he 22, 23 years old? You know, or maybe
It's
a little.
that. Yeah.
I mean, I say he looks like he's a teenager, but I guess well everyone looks at as a teenager to me these days, um, and in that respect, but you know you have to just understand that you really can make a difference. Everybody can make a difference out there, and that's really the message that we got. The Cold Case Symposium, a lot of messages, but it's just something that really needs to be talked about more often. So, was there any other speakers that I missed?
And the other one, so we did talk about Season of Justice, and Brad Schleppe, the executive director, was able to discuss the grant funding program that they have for families that are in need of awareness campaigns, whether it's billboards or maybe they need evidence testing, and that additional funding can be a barrier that law enforcement faces when they have evidence, but they just don't have the funds to be able to support that testing.
Yeah.
So Season of Justice was able to offer and share how those resources work and how to access that information.
Right. And it's funny, like I must be getting old because I sat through all these presentations and I didn't forget them, and now that you bring it up, it's like, yeah, but you know what though? Certain things stick with you more than others, right? So for me sitting in there, learning about the missing persons advocates and stuff like that, and with Lauren and Light the Way, those really stuck with me because I'm kind of saying, you know what, I've like I said, I think that really needs to be looked at in different in areas. It has to be done.
Yeah, and the last speaker that I wanted to mention, who's also doing a lot of work for these unidentified and missing cases, is Dr. Erin Kimmerly, and she's down at the University of South Florida. She's a forensic anthropologist, and she shared about the work that she does and the events, and she's actually hosting one this week, Missing in Florida, which is an event that brings together numerous different law enforcement agencies and offers resources for families if they need to file a report for a missing loved one, if they need to contribute a DNA sample, if they need to go through information to see if their lost loved one might fit some of these descriptions of some of these remains that have been located. So I think that we really tried to be intentional with the speakers that we invited and tried to offer our attendees a well-rounded presentation of the real need for the community to get involved in different ways that people can interact, and maybe new connections that people hadn't considered beforehand. So that was our goal, and I'm really happy with it, and I know Ryan is as well, and I think that we really accomplished that this year.
Yeah, no, and it's something you guys should be proud of too. I mean, it's just it's one of those things you can hang your head out there and say, we put together a great symposium, and I think you've reached a lot of people, and I think it's about changing the people's mindset too, especially the students, where they say, well, what's in this for me? Like, what can I do, kind of thing. This is what you could do. Anybody could do it.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're going to pivot from the Cold Case Symposium. So I want to make sure everyone heard about that and can tune into it, and when it comes out. But we're going to talk about what your area of expertise is, and as a board certified forensic entomologist, right? So for those of you that don't know what an entomologist is, right, we're talking about insects. But before we get into the actual insects and helping solve crimes at crime scenes, tell us what it takes to become a board certified forensic entomologist.
Yeah. So first of all, I didn't know that this was my career path as a kid, and I have to mention that my mom has always been incredibly supportive of my sometimes weird and creepy hobbies that might have involved collecting insects and other arthropods to keep as pets when I was a kid. So thank you, Mom, for that. And so my nickname Creepy Krystal as a kid, I think I fully embraced. And I really had a fascination for insects, but it wasn't until I was in my undergraduate program that I learned about forensic entomology. And once I learned about it and realized that there was a career where I could blend this passion for insects and use it in a way that's helpful for investigations, that really brought together two things that I was really passionate about. And so I finished my bachelor's degree. I moved to Ohio. I got my master's, and that's where I started to work in research in forensic entomology and assist with death investigation cases. And then I went to University of Windsor, so I moved to Canada and got my PhD. So I was there for about 4.5 years. And while I was there, I trained with another board-certified forensic entomologist. And it's a very small community. So there's 23 of us that are board-certified in North America. So there's not a lot of us,
Wow.
but we're a really great group. And so I was able to train with one of the best forensic entomologists in our community, and she taught me a lot. And so after I finished that training, I got my first faculty position in Delaware, and I was there for 2.5 years before I moved to Purdue. And so there's a lot of schooling, and then to become board certified, there's a certification exam that you have to complete. You have 12 hours to do it, so it's a full day exam, and it has multiple different components to test your knowledge and your skills and being able to identify these insects and apply it in investigations.
So there are only 23 board-certified forensic entomologists in the entire country.
In North America.
North America?
Yeah.
So that's it. Just so in the country, it could be maybe a dozen or less, right?
Yeah. So there are.
Wow.
There are 3 in Canada currently, and then 20 of us in the U.S. So it's a small field, but like I said, we're fantastic. We're very supportive.
Well, I'll tell you my quick introduction into entomology. When we had a crime scene, we had this individual was murdered in his apartment, and we got there a couple of days later. And what we thought was rat excrement turned out to be what they call pupa.
The pupae, yeah.
Pupae, yeah.
Yeah.
And I didn't know. So what happened was when the ME showed up, to do what the MEs do, and I said, "Hey, doc, don't step on the poop." I think I might have used another word there, but and it's like he looked at me like that's insect larva, that's so then because they get the entomologist in there, and it was actually pretty interesting about how there's a solution, right, that they put them in and that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
So I started learning about entomology. So one of the things that we talk about is the blowfly, right? That's probably one of the most important insects for death scene investigations, would you say?
Yeah. They're some of the first insects to show up, so they can smell the odor profiles associated with decomposition very quickly, much sooner than we can even detect it as humans. And so they arrive to the remains relatively quickly after death. And they arrive quickly because the female flies, they have to lay their eggs on a resource. And so they need to show up and locate that resource so that they can lay their eggs.
On one of the kick, we had C. Ferraro says, "I love the curtains, Dr. Krystal."
Oh, thank you. And if my computer was turned, this is my office at Purdue, and it is entirely decorated in insect artwork, and there's insects everywhere. So thank you for doing this.
Yeah, that's actually pretty interesting. So there's a discernible life cycle that the blowfly has that's important for investigators.
Yeah, so when the female flies show up, and there's other flies that show up as well, but we're going to focus on the females. She's looking for a place to lay those eggs, and so it's typically the natural openings of the body. Those are protective spaces for those eggs that are pretty delicate and fragile. And so those eggs will hatch, and what hatches out are really small maggots, and maggots go through several phases where they get progressively bigger, and all the maggots are doing is eating. And so the small ones, we call those first instar. Those are our smallest maggots. And they feed and they get bigger and they mature into a second instar. It's the second maggot stage. And get bigger and bigger. And now they're in the third instar. Those are those really large, really noticeable maggots. And then once they finish feeding, they will move away from the remains or maybe under the remains. If it's outside, they'll go into the soil a small distance. And when they do that, they're going to form this case that you mentioned. They're going to turn into that pupa. And so it's almost like a cocoon. And so they have this protective layer on the outside, and inside they're transforming into an adult fly. So eventually they'll emerge from that case. They'll inflate their wings, they'll harden, and now they can fly off and feed and start that life cycle again.
And this is all like within a certain period of time, right? So a certain number of hours, and it's pretty accurate, correct?
Yeah, so our insects rely on the ambient temperature for their development, so they can't generate heat the same way that we can. So the hotter it is outside, the faster they develop, and the cooler it is outside, the slower they develop. And so depending on the temperature, if it's a warm, week in the summer, it can be about a week and a half for them to complete that life cycle before they emerge out as an adult fly. So it can be pretty quick, but it's all dependent on the temperature.
And how do they go about collecting them? Like the crime scene tech shows, like I said, this is the kind of stuff they don't show you on CSI Miami. Tell us the real deal that we have to deal with.
Yeah, this is not glamorous, and I think that's why they don't necessarily show it on those TV shows. So when I get called to a scene or attend an autopsy, I'm looking for all of the different types of insects that I can observe. And so that's why it's really helpful to have an entomologist, because we're trained and we know what we're looking for and where to check and what to see. And so we're looking to see not just what are the insects that are there, but we're going to collect samples from all of those different sites on and around the remains. And we're looking for the oldest insects that have been feeding and developing on the remains. So if I'm collecting, some of those pupae, I'm collecting those, they've been developing, they've been feeding, they've been associated with the body for their entire life cycle. I can collect those and I can determine what kind of fly is it and what temperatures were they developing in. And I can use that information to provide a timeline. I can work backwards in time and figure out when were these pupae first laid as eggs by that fly. And because our flies arrive relatively quickly after death, that gives us an estimation of a minimum time that insects had colonized, had arrived and laid their eggs, and a minimum time that someone has been deceased. And so just to speak about the collection procedure, so depending on what stage in the life cycle, that determines how we're going to collect them. But we collect a live sample that we're going to keep alive, and we're going to raise those flies until they're adults, because maggots look very similar. And so we raise them to adults to be able to confirm our identification of what type of fly. And we're also collecting a sample, and we're going to kill them and preserve them so that we can stop their development when we do that collection. And so we're collecting 2 different samples. And like I said, this is not necessarily glamorous. We're in the scene. There's decomposition fluid. There's a very distinctive smell of decomposition that's associated with it. So I understand it's not for everybody. And it's something that a lot of my students that come through, we do a lot of research with animal carcasses to get them exposed. And so that's something that some of the students realize that maybe this isn't the right fit for me because of some of those elements.
No, exactly. And it helps with the post-mortem interval of the estimating time of death. And it's not the sole thing, right? But it's just added to the other things like the livor mortis and the rigor mortis. And this has just become another important part for investigators, because the time of death is extremely important. It's not like TV where the guy looks at his watch and says, okay, he died at 8:03 last night. Yeah, that doesn't happen. Mm-hmm. That doesn't happen.
If only it was that easy.
Yeah. So what kind of solution do you have to use to put these
So when we collect them, so the live samples, we're putting in containers that have some kind of substrate that can collect the extra liquid, because maggots, when they feed, they produce a lot of liquid and we don't want them to drown. And then we give them food. And I usually, when I go to a scene, I use canned wet dog food. That works really well for the maggots. But I've had investigators use everything from leftover Burger King to chicken nuggets to, any type of food. Maggots are not all that picky. And so we'll put them in a container with food. And then the preserved samples, so if it's possible, when I'm collecting my preserved samples, I always call it, I make maggot tea. And I drop the maggots in boiling water. And what that does is if you've ever spent time looking at maggots like I have, the boiling water will make them puff up so that when I remove them from that water and put them into alcohol can sometimes shrink the maggots. And so when we're analyzing maggots back in the lab, there's a lot of small characteristics that we have to look for. And so if we boil them in water, that helps to allow us to see some of those characters a little bit more easily under the microscope. But we just preserve them in ethanol. But I also have other investigators that they have rubbing alcohol. I've had some people submit things that were preserved in vodka or gin or whatever alcohol they had on hand.
Drunken flies.
Yeah. Yeah, as long as it's not whiskey or any cordial that has color, that's where I draw the line. But you can use pretty much any alcohol, and we store them in ethanol when we get them in the lab. So
that's actually kind of interesting. How long can a specimen last? If it's done correctly, it can last for how long, do you think? Forever?
So it can last for hundreds of years. And so when we have our adult flies, we put them on pins so that we don't have to actually handle the specimen. We just handle the pin. And we have a beautiful collection of insects here at Purdue that has specimens dating back to the early 1700s that you could still take out and look at under the microscope. And our maggots that are preserved in ethanol, they will last a long time as well. One of the concerns is that the alcohol will evaporate away if you don't have a tight enough seal. So just making sure that they're well preserved, you can have specimens for hundreds of years. So
interesting.
Yeah.
And then besides the blowfly, the carrier beetle, I guess, is another important aspect of the forensic entomology.
Yeah. So we have our flies, and like I said, they're some of our first to show up, and flies are excellent at flying, and so they can get there pretty quickly. Beetles, while they can fly, they're not the fastest or the best flyers necessarily. They can certainly crawl, and they can access the remains. And so we have beetles that come in at different stages of decomposition at different time points, and they have different things that they're there for. So we have some beetles that are coming in because the remains are a food source. Some of them are going to lay their eggs that are going to develop on the remains. Some of them are actually predators, and they show up because they want to eat the maggots that are on the remains. And so they're hunting and they're feeding. And so we have lots of a pretty large diversity of insects that are going to show up to the remains for all different reasons. And so I think that's one of the interesting things about forensic entomology is that there's no shortage of insects to study, and every decomposition scene, every decomposition research project is going to give you something very different. So it's always changing.
Yeah, no, it's actually kind of interesting. I learned that too because they come to eat, and everybody's got to eat, and that's it's basically what happens. And so, tell us about how the forensic entomology can help us determine where the victim died, kind of thing. So if it was a lack of a better adjective, dump site, and were they killed there or someone else, that kind of thing. Just can you walk us through that a bit before as we.
Yeah, so as you know, perpetrators will try all sorts of different mechanisms to try to hide the remains or conceal their crime. And so one of those techniques is to physically move the remains somewhere else. So if there was a homicide that took place in an urban area, that's probably more likely that it's going to be recognized. Somebody's going to observe it. So a perpetrator might try to move it. And depending on the distance that they're willing to move it, some people, you would be shocked at multiple states that they're willing to drive these remains to get them away from where they live so that there's limited connection. And so if we have an instance where a set of remains are colonized by insects that are local to our area, so certain species that we would only find in one area, and then those remains with those insects get moved to a different area, and a forensic entomologist is able to collect those and say, well, wait a minute, we don't get these insects here, but we do get them over in that state. So we should look into any potential events that have happened in that location. So the insects can be an indicator of certain areas, certain regions where they're known to be prevalent, and that can be helpful for a forensic entomologist to indicate that a set of remains have been moved.
Have you come across cases like that?
So I haven't had any like that. We've certainly had. I've been involved in cases where the remains have been moved, but not so much that they've been moved a long distance where we've been able to determine those differences in patterns. But I do have colleagues that have had those cases, and also had a different side where somebody driving a car to get away from a crime ended up collecting a bunch of insect fragments on their car and in the grill of their car. And the forensic entomologist was able to collect all of those parts and figure out a path of travel. So, how did they move? Because they have all of these different insects from all of these different states. And so, there's lots of different applications for our insects. So,
Yep, that's actually kind of interesting because you can just run the gamut, especially out in the Midwest, right? There's probably lots of different bugs that we don't even know about over here on the East Coast.
there's an enormous amount of diversity, and there's lots of insects that we have yet to identify. So there's no shortage.
So how many times do you get called to a crime scene in a year? How many times you get called out for this?
Yeah, so it just depends on the year, and I would say our busier times of the year are generally late spring into the summer. So it's warmer out. That smell of decomposition is a lot more noticeable, and people are walking around, they're hiking, and so some of those reasons is why we're a little bit busier. But I think it just depends. I think last year we had about 25 in total, 5 different scenes that we went to.
Wow.
And so we also do research with our local coroner's office. So we collect insects from non-suspicious deaths as well, so that we can catalog them and keep track of insects that are associated with human remains, whether it's a violent crime or not. So we're always collecting.
Sound like they got a donut sale going on out there, but yeah, no. So it's actually a kind of interesting aspect of the forensics because there we go. It's an interesting interest of the forensics because it's really not spoken about much. I think because like you said, so few people are actually certified to do this, and it's kind of interesting. So, like even New York City, I don't believe we ever had an entomologist on duty. They'd have to reach out to somewhere else and bring that individual in.
Yeah, and that's what most of us are consultants. So there's one board certified forensic entomologist who's actually at a forensic facility, and that's the only person that has a position like that. The rest of us are professors or we're working at museums, and so the consulting and that element, working with law enforcement, is something that we do in addition to our teaching and our research and our mentoring of students.
Yeah, it's actually it's really interesting, and like I said, I'm going through all the comments. So here's a question that we could do. Like, on your website, which is posted in the description as an expert witness,
Mm-hmm.
how does this play out in court?
Yeah, so I think that's one of the benefits of having an educator that's an expert witness. So I'm able to get on the stand and explain to the jury the basics of forensic entomology and make it relatable to those insects that they've probably seen maggots in their trash can. They understand what maggots are doing, but I can explain how we're able to use them and use their life cycle. Sorry, Purdue police are after something here, so. So I would say in court, it seems to hold up really
You gotta
well.
love the firemen, right? Yeah.
We also, Purdue has its own fire department. We're really well staffed here on campus. So in court, I think that, and most of my colleagues would say the same, that we can explain our science in a way that makes sense to the jury, and that plenty of us have testified, some of us in multiple different cases. And as long as you can explain that story and the relevance and what the connection was and how it supports the case. And so, Joe, as you mentioned, this is one piece of physical evidence. This is not the only piece of evidence that's going to be used in court. This is just one piece that can corroborate that timeline and really provide some additional support for that investigation.
Yeah, it's actually very interesting. So Dr. Hans's her LLC, her limited liability company, it's in the show notes if you want to learn more about what she does and how she does it. I think it's a great opportunity. Do you have any final thoughts for the night? Anything that I didn't cover that you wanted to go over quick, or if there's any question that anybody has?
I mean, I feel like I've gotten a chance to talk about our symposium. Like I said, educators out
Yep.
there, if you're interested. I also, if you're a high school educator and you're looking for somebody to speak about a different aspect of science, I'm always happy to speak to all age groups, but especially high schoolers that might not know that this is an option out there and a career path for them.
Yeah, it's actually it's a fascinating aspect of it. Like I said, I had to learn while I was working doing this, because nobody teaches you any of these things, and so I had to learn on my own about it. Not and I didn't learn enough to be able to do it for a living, but to be able to recognize it. And I think every detective out there and every investigator needs to have at least a basic 101 course. I don't care if it's a college course or something you teach in
Yeah.
regards to that, just to give, because it like I really thought it was rat turd, the like, and it's something that hey, you won't know unless you learn. So
Yeah,
it's
so I try my best to offer resources and trainings in different states. So I train the coroners in Illinois, and I train law enforcement in Indiana and in Ohio and all the surrounding states that I work in, just to make sure that they're able to recognize the
yep.
importance of insect evidence and that they know at least who to call if they see it and they want to use the services.
Yep, it's a great point, like I said, and we'll make sure we get all your information out there, and hopefully, like the symposium, I said, will be out in Jacksonville,
Yeah.
Florida next year sometime. You said in the fall again?
In the fall, and we haven't finalized a date yet. So as soon as we do,
Okay.
I'll send it your way.
Well, as soon as you find all that, I'd love to have you on again, and we could talk about that. We'll have Ryan back on, and maybe we could do the whole show. We'll get Lauren. We could do everybody all at once to try to help promote that, because it's an excellent cause, and it's something that needs to be done for so many different reasons. But number one reason is for the families.
Yes.
Okay, everybody, we want to thank Dr. Hans for her time tonight. We went actually over an hour. Sorry about that, but it was actually a lot of great comments on here. I was fascinated. I learned a lot of stuff about the bugs, so it's actually kind of interesting. And like I said, some of the people, like they're crime writers. They're eating this stuff up because they don't know. I bet you get people sometimes send you an email and say, "I'm doing this crime scene. How do I handle this?" Right? So I get those from time to time. But so I want to thank you, Krystal, again for coming on. And if you missed any of the symposium, we're going to post a link in the future so that you can watch it. I think it goes on YouTube. It'll be available. The links will be available on YouTube on your website. Is that was going to go? Okay.
Yes. Yeah.
So yeah, we'll make sure everyone gets those. So Saturday, I have another show lined up at 2 o'clock. I know I usually do Sundays, but this one is Saturday. This is with Dr. Kimberly Masnick from Indian River State College. She runs a cold case institute, which is slightly different from what Krystal does. But it's still important the same. So don't miss that one if you're interested in that respect, because it's actually a kind of unique setup that she's got over there. And Tuesday, I have another special guest. I'll tell you about that on Saturday, because I want to focus on Kimberly on Saturday. So you guys, thank you again for all your support. This has been great. Remember, Domestic Violence Month. Try to get people help if they need it. And Krystal, thanks again for coming on. It has been great talking to you again.
Thanks for having me.
Take care, everybody. Have a great night.